All right, well, how's it going, everybody? I hope you all had a wonderful holiday season. And for those of you that have New Year's resolutions coming up, I encourage you to get started before New Year's comes around. Instead of getting a couple of steps backwards as we go through the holiday season, eating bad food and drinking alcohol and all that stuff, and then getting started, you might as well start right now. Because if it's something you want bad enough, you might as well just go ahead and do it. And that's why we're here today with this training video. We're going to be talking about mobility and what it is and answering all of your questions. I get questions all the time. What is mobility? Why do I need it? How do I get it? All of these wonderful things. So as you can see behind me, there are a plethora of mobility tools out there on the market. And we're going to just start off by talking about what mobility is first and foremost, and then going into a little bit about what each of these tools are that you see behind me and how do we use them. Because I've found through my career that one of the things that stops people from incorporating things like foam rollers is, how do I use it? And there's a lot of different information out there, so I'm here to debunk some of those questions for you. But first and foremost, the question of what is mobility? And mobility is oftentimes interchanged with the word flexibility. And while flexibility is a component of mobility, it is not mobility in of itself. Mobility, from the root Latin mobilitas, means the ability to go anywhere and do anything at any time. And if you look at the way that humans evolved over millennia, we basically would just wake up and go throughout our day hunting and fighting and gathering and performing, and we didn't have so many chronic problems with our lack of flexibility and things like that. We just woke up and we did what we had to do, and if we didn't, we couldn't survive and we wouldn't make it another day. That's a whole topic for another day. Now, where we get into the flexibility part of the conversation is that with mobility meaning essentially freedom of performance, if we take a look at, say, the shoulder joint is technically classified as a mobile joint because it can move in multiple planes of direction. I can move my arm in all sorts of different ways. I can twist it. I can do all these wonderful things because it has the freedom of movement, the freedom of performance. Whereas another segment of the body, say the lower back, is not a segment of mobile joints because they only move in one direction, or at least they should. And if we ask it to do more than it is capable of doing, it's eventually going to break. So the first thing to understand with mobility from the anatomy perspective is that certain joints should move in all sorts of different directions and certain joints shouldn't. There was a famous article written called the Joint by Joint Approach. I'll go ahead and link something to that here later, but it basically states that the human body is made up of an alternating pattern of mobile joints and stable segments. And if we understand that the mobile joints are the ankle, the hip, the thoracic spine, the cervical spine, the shoulders, and the wrists, those are the components of the body that we want to move all around. The other joints, such as the foot, the lower back, the knee, the elbow, these aren't meant to move a whole lot. They're meant to be stabilized. Now, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because I know a lot of you tuned in to say, hey, I just want to learn how to use a foam roller. And that's what we're about to get into. If you guys want to learn more about what mobility is, check out my book, Better Golf from the Inside Out. It is all about mobility and performance, written from the perspective of a golfer. There is a link to it in this description already. But to answer the question that most of you have is, what is the difference between all of these tools? There are a lot of things out there. What should I get? How should I be using them? What is right for me? Now, the cool thing that we're going to do here in this video today is I'm going to talk in a minute about the 3 techniques that you need to know to get the most out of 90% of this equipment. So it doesn't matter if you're using a roller, a stick, a ball, or a specialty tool. The 3 techniques that we're going to cover later in this session will teach you how to use all of them. So Broadly speaking, I've divided everything up into a couple of different categories. The first one, and probably the most common one that most of you watching are familiar with, are foam rollers. And the somewhat confusing thing is that they come in all these different shapes, different sizes, different densities, and not even all of them are made out of foam. The biggest difference when we're looking at all of these is how soft they are. You can see this one is very soft. I can push on it and there's a lot of cushion, whereas something like this guy here has absolutely no give at all. It is really solid. And then we have things that are in between. We have big rollers with little concave surfaces. We have smaller rollers with a deeper channel. And we even have rollers that vibrate. Now, the biggest thing to understand with all these, again, is for the most part, you can do all of the same things with each of these rollers. How do I turn? Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Sure, this one might be better at a specific thing than this one might be a better thing for a specific than this one, etc. In my collection over the years, I've gotten a little bit of everything because I love mobility. But the point being, this guy will do basically all the same things as this guy, will do the same as this one and that one. So don't you worry about that later. Later in this video, we're going to talk about what to look for when starting your mobility collection and what's going to fit your budget and your needs. But moving on, away from the very common foam rollers, are probably the most next common, which are mobility balls. And mobility balls we can separate into basically two categories in of themselves. We have a single ball, and then we have a double ball, also known as a peanut. They do slightly different things, but again, the three techniques that we're going to talk about in this training session apply to all of them. We have big balls, we have small balls, there are again double balls, there are balls that vibrate, there's all sorts of different things. Again, like the foam roller, the big thing here is going to be, say, the density. This guy looks really aggressive, is very spiky, but this is just a dryer ball. You put this in your laundry to help fluff up your clothes, and it's actually super soft. So while it has all these nubs on it, it's not nearly as aggressive as something like this little golf ball. And the golf ball, because it's so small and so dense, is very acute pressure. And so we'll talk again later, what's the most important thing for you and your needs. The dimples on this ball do something slightly different than a ball with no dimples. Again, though, you can do everything you need to with this, with that. They're going to be slightly different in their specifics, but the job will get done with the three techniques that we're going to talk about. Now, let's go into probably the third most common category. So number one, foam rollers. We see them everywhere. They're gaining a ton of popularity. Then we go into mobility balls. They have also gained a lot of popularity. For those of you that golf, you probably have one of these already. If you play tennis, you have one of these already. Softball, this is just a practice softball. So you guys get the idea. It doesn't have to be specifically a mobility specific tool. We can get creative with them. But going into number three, foam rollers, balls, then we have sticks. Sticks are similar to rollers, except instead of laying our body weight on them, we apply pressure, like a rolling pin for your body. They come in different shapes and different sizes. Again, though, the three techniques that we're going to talk about later in this video apply to all of them. So it doesn't matter if you're using a roller, if you're using a ball, if you're using a stick. The three techniques are going to be basically the only three techniques that you need to know. And for those of you wondering, and for those of you that read the description, we are also going to talk about what do you do if you don't have any tools, because you don't need tools to improve your mobility. But before we move on to these three techniques, just to round it out and to finish it up, we also have what I'm going to group as a specialty category or a miscellaneous category. This is where things like the Mobilitas Power Band come in. This is a compression wrap. This is an incredible tool, multi-purpose. There are very similar techniques that you can use to the three that we're going to be talking about, slightly different. It's going to be a hybrid between the three techniques we cover and what we do if we don't have any equipment. That makes this a very versatile piece of equipment for mobility and for strengthening your body. So if you guys want one of those, contact me. I will help you get that all set up. We also have things like this guy. Looks really weird, looks a little bit like a lobster claw, but this is an amazing tool for things like your forearms, which you can get to using things like balls and sticks and rollers, but because it's a specific tool, it is much more suited to the job. We also have things like this. This is a vibrating, heating back wrap. It doesn't necessarily use the 3 techniques that we're going to be covering in this video, but it's a great recovery and mobility tool nonetheless. And then we have this guy, which does use the 3 techniques we're going to cover. And so if you've been to a gym and you've seen this and you say, what the heck is it? Just note that what you learn in this training video will cover that and how to use it. So I know we've already covered a lot. Just to wrap up everything that we've talked about so far, what is mobility? Mobility is essentially the ability to go anywhere and do anything at any time, the freedom of performance, if you will. And then we have our different tools in the categories that we were just talking about. Now, the most common one that we're going to see is a fairly basic foam roller. So I want to cover the 3 techniques that we're going to be talking about today with this guy. If you have a different tool, if you have questions about what we're going to talk about, just shoot me a note. We'll talk about it one-on-one. If you're watching this live, you can always throw up a question and we'll get to those as well to make sure that your questions are being answered. But again, because this is the most common one that we're going to see out there, you go to basically any gym or yoga studio and you're going to see one of these. You might even own one of these. And you may have seen some videos on how to use it. That's awesome. But what we're going to talk about are just the 3 techniques. There's only 3. Well, there's more than 3, but these 3 are going to cover 90% of your mobility needs. So let's go ahead and reposition the camera here. And I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible for you. And we're going to use our butt, there it goes, as the example. Really common to roll out our glutes. And we get to use all 3 techniques in one muscle group. So to keep it super simple without giving it too many technical names, because depending on the source of where you've gotten your information from, it could be called various things. But we're going to keep this super simple. Technique number 1. The roller stays still and your body moves. I'm compressing the tissues of my butt and I'm moving my leg. Because remember, if you were watching earlier in this video, we have basically 6 major mobile joints. The ankle, the hip, the thoracic spine, the cervical spine, the shoulders, and the wrists. The butt muscles surround a mobile joint, the hip. If the hip is losing mobility, we need to bring some movement back to the tissues that surround the hip. That's your butt. So if we compress the tissues of the butt and then move the leg, we are asking the tissues that surround that mobile joint, the hip, to loosen up. Compress the muscles, move the joint. I can go straight forward and back, I can move a little bit on my side, but regardless, technique number 1, the roller stays still, the body moves. Technique number 2, the body stays still, and the roller moves. Now you might be thinking, Blaine, your body's moving, but you get the idea. In this case, my leg is staying basically still, and I'm moving the roller, if you will. I can go with the grain, I can go against the grain. My leg is, for all intents and purposes, pretty relaxed. It's not tense, because that leads us to our 3rd technique. So number 1, the roller or the ball or whatever you're using, it stays still, the body moves. Technique number 2, the body stays still while the roller moves. Now at any point when doing either of these techniques, we can do technique number 3, where essentially neither of them are moving, but there is something going on here. So let's say I'm rolling around and I feel this knot in my butt. I'm like, oh man, I'm rolling on it, I'm moving, but that knot won't go away. How do I get rid of it? Well, you find where it is, you apply direct pressure onto it, and then you relax for a moment, you let the roller or the ball or whatever you're using sink into that tissue as deep as you can, and then here's where technique number 3 comes in. You're gonna contract. I'm squeezing my butt, I'm squeezing my leg on that knot. I hold it for about 5 seconds, and then I breathe. As I let it out, I relax completely, and then I scrub it up. Now that little knot has started to release, it's moved. I apply direct pressure, I squeeze, I breathe, I relax, and I let it go, and that knot releases. So the act of contracting, full breath cycle, relaxing takes about 5 seconds, and we repeat. So let's sum this up again. Step 1, roller stays still, I move my leg. Forward and backward, that gives us, if you're technical, extension. We can go internal and external rotation. We can combine them. We're essentially putting as much range of motion as we can into that mobile joint. Then we can move the roller without moving the leg, forward and backward, side to side. And as we're doing this, we can contract, relax, and break it up. Now the breath, we talked about the breath in this 3rd technique, but just note that the breath is critically important for any of these techniques. If you just sit on a roller, for example, and you find yourself tensing up and holding your breath, you're doing too much. You need to take some pressure off. Your tissues aren't ready for it yet. So if you ever find yourself holding your breath, you're doing too much, too quick, you need to back off. That right there is the number 1 reason why you would choose, say, this one versus this one. This one, being softer and spongier, allows you to apply more pressure with less discomfort. So for those of you that are just starting out, get things that are softer. So this leads us into the next segment of this video is, what do I need and what do I look for? So when you're just starting out, use things that are soft, a spongier, foamier foam roller. Use something like a tennis ball, if you're doing the ball route, that has some give to it. As you get more comfortable with your mobility and you improve your range of motion and your tissues adapt to these pressures that we're putting on them, then you can take something like a tennis ball and maybe upgrade it into a lacrosse ball. They're basically the same size. One is super soft, one is super dense, and then there's things anywhere in between. Same density, but smaller, smaller, smaller even still. And then you can say a golf ball is smaller and more dense. So you, over time, will get to know what's right for you and your body and what you're working on. Just because some manufacturer out there claims this is the greatest foam roller, this is anatomically correct, it can do all these things, that might not be right for you. That's why I have such a large collection, although I'm also a mobility nut. That being said, probably the most basic thing that you can get just to get started is the softer foam roller and a tennis ball. At first, even with something like a tennis ball that has a lot of sponge, if you're using it on, say, your butt, like we were just talking about, step 1, compress, move. So this doesn't move, but your leg does. Step 2, your leg doesn't move, but this does. Step 3, contract, relax. Even then, this might be a lot because it's just new to you. Something else to keep in mind, depending on you and your body, this ball here is much bigger, but much, much more dense. Sometimes the larger size will be more comfortable than the smaller size, even though the densities are different. Because this larger surface area spreads out the pressure, whereas the smaller ball is more acute pressure. At the same time, if you're working on a very tricky spot, get a small and firm one. Right? So you see where we're going here. There's no right, there's no wrong. Regardless of which tool you use, the 3 techniques we just covered remain the same. To cover them again, number 1, the ball or the roller or whatever stays still, we move the joint. Number 2, the joint stays still, we move the tissue. Number 3, while we're working these all out, contract, breathe, relax, and then scrub it up, going deeper and deeper each time. A couple of principles to think of while going through this, regardless of the equipment, is 1, always breathe. We talked about that a second ago. If you're doing any kind of rolling and you find yourself tensing up or holding your breath is too much too quick, ease off the pressure, ease off the intensity, slow down, take your time, and maybe if you need to, get a different tool. Number 2, it's typically better to start in one area, work it really good, and then spread yourself out. Number 3, you will typically, not always, but typically get better results when you focus on somewhere near the mobile joint as opposed to the meat of the muscle. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say your hamstrings are tight. This is really common. We sit all the time. The back of your leg, your hamstrings, they get tight. Well, you might think, oh, well, if I just take my ball or my roller and go straight into the meat of my hamstring, that will improve my range of motion. And yes, it will, but it might take longer. Whereas if you start at the end of the hamstring by the mobile joint, this will feed slack back into the hamstring. Then when you go to the meat of the muscle, it's much more comfortable. But if you're just starting out this process and your muscles are super tight and they don't have a lot of range of motion, and you go to compress them directly where it hurts, it's just gonna hurt. So think of it as, okay, where's the mobile joint? Ankle, hip, thoracic spine, cervical spine, shoulder, wrist. Work the tissues near that joint and feed slack back in. Your elbow is not a mobile joint. If you have elbow pain, you can get rid of elbow pain by first working the tissues near the wrist or by the shoulder. If you work, say, up by the shoulder or up in the chest to improve the range of motion of this shoulder, it'll feed slack down to the elbow, taking pressure off of the elbow. Then you can work the tissues of your arm. But focus on the mobile joint first, then get down into the meat of the muscle, and then you can work on all those other things. So if you've been foam rolling and you're like, I'm not seeing the improvement, use your time smarter. Work the areas that give you the most benefit with the least amount of time. So, to sum up everything so far, what is mobility? The mobility is the freedom of performance at any time. The freedom to move around, the freedom to perform. Mobility is also why you can hop in a car and go somewhere. We hear about people becoming immobile when they can't get up and walk around. The anatomical portion of mobility comes from a joint that moves with freedom, right? So that's the correlation between them. What tool you use is up to you and your body and your needs. There's no right or wrong. There's just going to be better things for you at that time, but most of you can get by with a basic foam roller with a little bit of a spongy surface to get the technique down. Then at a certain point, you might have done a lot of work with this spongier, softer roller and be like, hey, it's just not doing it for me anymore. Let me upgrade into something that's a little bit firmer. Maybe it has a specialty surface. These ribs increase the surface area of your tissue when you're rolling on it, and this channel alleviates pressure off your spine if you're rolling your back. Neither here nor there, but it's important to understand when you're purchasing something. Again though, this will do basically all the same things as this. It's just a level of intensity, and you can figure that one out over time. But the biggest thing is, don't let the lack of equipment stop you from getting started in the first place. Just if you have access to a basic foam roller at your gym, start playing around with it. That's how you'll know what you need. Then you can make a more informed decision later down the road. Now, one more thing I want to talk about here. What if you don't have any equipment at all? And this is a really important one, because sometimes people say, hey, look, I don't have a lot of mobility, but at the same time, I don't want to invest in equipment, or I don't have access to equipment. How do I get started? And this is a technique that I call power stretching. I wrote about it in my book. Again, the book is in the link to this video, so feel free to download it. It's a free download. But power stretching takes the concepts we just talked about and applies them without a tool. To sum it up and then we'll talk about how to do it. You take a joint, which is restricted, you put it into that restricted position, and then you contract and relax your muscles while in that what we call end range position. What do I mean by that? I'm going to give you an example using one of my favorite hip exercises called the frog stretch. This one is awesome. With the frog stretch, let's get maybe this is the best way of doing it. I'm going to get into my hands and knees, what we call quadruped position, and I'm going to start to splay my legs. And let's just say this is as much as I can go. My legs won't splay anymore. This is what we call our end range. The joints have hit their end. Now in this position, I'm going to squeeze my butt and try to press my hips down to the floor. Breathe. And then relax. When I relax, I can go a little farther. Repeat, squeeze, relax, squeeze. And then before you know it, my legs go farther apart. And now I can start to do other things. I can start to do things like this internal rotation. I can press my leg into the ground. My left leg right now is being pressed into the ground pretty hard. I breathe, I relax. Now my joint rotation is better. I can go to the other side. I can press this foot into the ground. I could have a partner come over, hold my leg down, and I try to press up against it. Whatever it is, you put the joint into its end range where it can't go any farther. You contract and relax the muscles around that joint. You breathe and you relax. The important thing when power stretching is the muscles you squeeze don't have to be specific. We don't squeeze individual muscles in a functional movement system. Meaning, if we go to the gym and we get into that machine and start doing a bicep curl, it's going to isolate a bicep. That will make my bicep bigger. But in the natural world, that's not how our body works. Our body works as a system. When I pick something up, like a rock or a laundry basket, all of my muscles are working in one regard or another. So don't get caught up in, oh, I'm not squeezing the right muscle. There is no right muscle. Here's another example of something called a scorpion stretch. For my shoulder, I put my arm out to the side and I press up into it. Now I can't go any farther. I went from here, arm is flat, I roll into it. Now I'm going to take my right arm on the ground, I'm going to push it. It's pushing down, it's pushing down, it's pushing down. I breathe. And then relax. Now I can go a little farther. Press that arm down. I feel a big stretch in the front of my chest. Press the arm down. Breathe. Relax. Now I can go farther. And each time we do that, we improve the end range of motion that we were just working on before. It went from restricted to slowly opening up. We've improved that range of motion. So if you don't have any equipment at all, do power stretching. Right? It's an incredible way to improve your range of motion. For those of you that do yoga, you've seen very similar concepts. That's why yoga's been so successful over so many years, is that we put ourselves into a restricted position, we reach, we press, and we breathe. So if you are a yogi and you want to get more out of your yoga sessions, use the concept that we just talked about. If you're doing something like downward dog, don't just get into that position. Get into that position actively. Press away, push down, breathe. Go through cycles of contracting and relaxing. Not only will you get stronger and improve your range of motion, but you're going to connect your brain to your body and teach them how to communicate. If we just simply improve your range of motion, but we don't teach the brain how to talk to the body in that range of motion, you're vulnerable for injury. Because now you're going to be walking around on Bambi legs and you're like, well, how do I stay up? You haven't learned how to stabilize in those new end range positions. So it's really important as you become more mobile to also learn how to use your body to stabilize that range of motion so you don't get hurt. I hope that one makes sense. Now, before we go into anything else, I'm just going to take a second here. Has anybody thrown a question up? If so, now's your time. We'll open it up to Q&A. And if not, you can always put something in in the comments later, Francesca, so happy to learn about these techniques and improve mobility. Awesome, Francesca. I appreciate you being here. Again, if you have any questions at any point, just let me know. Awesome. Sorry, I'm having trouble scrolling. We have some people getting tagged in here. Awesome. Tons of people watching today. I love that. Beautiful. Looks like we had a couple of comments, not necessarily any questions. So I'm going to leave you guys with this. If you do want to learn more about mobility, again, I've already mentioned a couple times, download my book. There's a link in the description, Better Golf from the Inside Out. You don't need to be a golfer to get a lot out of that book. I just wrote it that way because I work with a lot of golfers, and golf, in my eyes, is a great representation of, oh, okay, we do have a question coming in. Awesome. Francesca, go ahead and type away. I'll keep talking until I see the question pop up. But go ahead and download that. It's at book.mobilitasathletics.com. In a separate video or video series, I might review all of these products. If you guys see one and you're like, what is that? I want to know more about it. I can create a separate video for that as well, so no problems there. If anybody's going to be in Orlando, if anybody's coming to Orlando, January 23rd, I'm giving 2 presentations at the PGA show, one on behalf of the PGA of America, one on behalf of the Titleist Performance Institute, or TPI. I'd love for you guys to come on out and watch those as well. That's going to be at the Orange County Convention Center, January 23rd. Over, one of them's at the TPI Fitness and Wellness stage, and the other one, I should know what room it's in, but it's going to be in one of the education conference rooms. While we're waiting, Francesca says she has a question coming in. I'm going to wait for that in just a second. While we're waiting for that, for those of you that are just hopping on, let's just go back here for a second. We have rollers, we have balls, we have sticks, and we have some specialty type tools. But the 3 techniques that we just talked about apply to any of these. Here we go. Francesca, I have spasticity in my right leg due to multiple sclerosis. I currently do adaptive golf. Awesome, Francesca. Adaptive golf, really great. One of my friends, Gianna Rojas, the one-handed lady golfer, she does a lot with adaptive golf. Tell me a little bit more, if you will, about your right leg and what the problems are. In your golf swing, is it causing anything where it causes you to slice the ball, lose distance, or just play with pain? And if not, we'll just talk a little bit about improving right leg mobility. While we're waiting for that to come in, something also that is not necessarily the topic of this conversation, but something important in general, is we're talking about all these different mobility techniques, ways to improve your range of motion. But the number one thing to keep in mind, underlying all of this, if you guys don't eat well, drink well, sleep well, it doesn't do us any good. We have to have the foundation to build performance on. So don't just cut corners. Okay, here we go. So it makes it hard to stand. Awesome. So Francesca, I see where we're going with this one. So there are going to be times where balance, awesome. So let's talk about balance real quick while we're talking about it. Where does balance come from? And more times than not, I know my head's cut off right now, but more times than not, when we're talking about balance, first off, we're talking about the alignment of our skeleton, if you will. We want our ears over the shoulders, over the hips, over the knees, over the heels. If we're in balance, then our center of gravity is aligned. However, a lot of times, because of the way that we live, what we call text neck, extension of the back, now our body is trying to fight itself. Because we're rounded forward, because our hips are tight, we're no longer aligned, and our body is constantly having to try to stabilize. Now, one of the things that starts to happen if our body is out of alignment is we begin to stabilize not with our muscles, but what we call joint-on-joint stabilization. So what I'm seeing here, Francesca, is if you're having, say, right hip problems that are throwing off your swing because of limited range of motion, if, say, the hip flexor in the front is tight and we have multiple hip flexors, but if they are tight, it's going to pull your back into extension. Now, in order to stabilize, the hip joint is going to look for bone on bone to stabilize rather than muscular stability. Same thing with the lower back. We get grinding of the discs because of this lack of alignment. Now, if we can improve the range of motion on, say, the front of the hip, now this part of the body is aligned and the muscles will work the way that they need to work. So I'm going to say two things here for you, Francesca, because I think a lot of people can benefit from these two things. Hip flexors being tight, affecting balance and range of motion are incredibly, incredibly common. Couple of things. You know, let's even take the tools out of the equation. And let's go 2 steps here. Step number 1, we want to get your butt turned on. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay down. I like to put my hands underneath my butt, legs out, and we're just going to simply, this looks super basic, but I promise you it helps. Squeeze your butt, both cheeks, as hard as you can. Try to turn one of them off, so right cheek off, turn it back on. Turn your left cheek off, turn it back on. Turn them both off, turn them back on. And repeat, right cheek off, back on. Left cheek off, both on. Both off, both on. You may at first find that your butt doesn't even turn on. Just take as much time as you need to until you can feel them both squeezing pretty firmly. Then, once you can squeeze them both firmly, once you can turn them individually on and off, get your feet flat. Get your hands out of there and start lifting your hips. Squeeze your butt, lift your hips. If you can do this without cramping in the back of your legs, you're on the right track. We're just getting your butt to turn on. From here, we can try to do one leg glute bridge extensions. Again, if you cramp, you've gone too far too quick. But we're just getting your butt to turn on. The reason we want your butt to turn on is so that we can now do this exercise. This is called a couch stretch. It's a hip flexor stretch. I'm going to put my leg against something like this couch, and I'm just going to hang out in this position for a minute. Now, I'm going to squeeze my butt and try to press my hip down to the floor. The reason we want to turn the butt on first is when your butt is turned on, the opposite muscles, or your hip flexors, have to turn off. It's the same reason why when you do a bicep curl, your bicep contracts while your tricep relaxes. So if we have overly tight front of the hip, we need to contract the back of the hip, which is your butt. So we're just going to hang out here, press your hip down to the ground as best you can. If and when you're ready, we then take your other leg and bring it out in front, and we repeat, trying to press this hip down to the ground by squeezing your butt. Hang out here as long as you need to. You can add some rotation into it, and then only when you're ready, we try to come up. When you come up, it's not because you've extended your back, it's because you've opened up your hips. So start low, press this forward, and then over time, get this to open up. The harder you squeeze your butt, the more that this begins to relax. If you do this whole progression that we just talked about, I kid you not, 10 minutes per leg. Activate your glutes, 2-3 minutes. Work on opening up that hip, 4, 5, 6 minutes. That's going to take you about 10 minutes. Do the other leg. It's going to rebalance your lower body. It's going to turn your butt back on, and it's going to help alleviate some of that pain that you get in the hip while improving your posture. Awesome, Francesca, you're making my day. So you're doing this right now along with me. Beautiful. Biggest thing, don't rush it. Take your time. Slower with intentional practice is going to be better than trying to rush it. We can't just force the tissues to adapt and relax. We have to go through the techniques that we've been talking about today. Always breathe, big full breaths. If you can't constantly, then you're doing too much too quick. Now, once you've brought some health back into that hip, then you can start doing the other things like the foam rolling to take it to that next level. A lot of times if your tissues are too tight and you start to just foam roll, even using the techniques we talked about, it might be painful. If that's the case, number one thing is always avoid pain. So do what you need to get out of those positions. So we go through what we just talked about to recap, and this is a power stretching progression. Again, I wrote about it in my book. If you guys want to get that, book.mobilitasathletics.com. There's a link in the description. But again, let's get the tissues to activate, get your butt to turn on, squeeze it on, turn it off. Both on, right off, both on, left off, both on, both off. Repeat as much as you need to until you can work each cheek individually. Then progress into glute extensions. 5, 10, 15, 20 of these. Make sure you don't have any back pain, knee pain, hip pain. Single legs without cramping, without pain. Then, once the glute is active, we can begin to relax the back. We start here in this quadruped position. We squeeze our butt, we press the hip down to the ground. Maybe 2 minutes. We bring this leg out. Same thing. We're trying to open this hip. It's not that we're arching our back. It's that we're extending the hip. We're feeling the stretch in the front of this hip. 2-3 minutes. Work yourself up. 2 or 3 minutes. So this whole thing could take 5 to 10 minutes per leg. Switch sides. Do the exact same thing on the other side. There are other progressions like this for the upper body if you want to open up the chest and the shoulders because you're rounded forward, you're getting neck pain, jaw pain, anything like that. We'll talk about those in a separate video. And then once those tissues have started to renormalize, we go back to the techniques we talked about in the beginning of this video. Number 1, roller stays still, we move the leg. Number 2, the leg stays still, we move the roller. Step 3, we find a tissue adhesion or a knot, we contract on it, we breathe, we relax, and then we scrub it up. Last thing, while I'm thinking about it, an advanced version of what we just talked about for you, Francesca, would be to use something like the power band that we were talking about. And this is the Mobilitas power band. Let me know if anybody watching wants one. But we would do something like this. This is a slightly more advanced. We take the band, we wrap it around, and then tuck it under. Now, because there's a compression, when we do this exercise, it's more effective. More effective as in it's going to stretch and isolate the tissues that we want to stretch quicker. That being said, if you are just starting out and you use the band, you could simply wrap it like I have now, squeeze, relax, squeeze, relax, and that would be plenty. You don't have to worry about getting into those positions. Yes, nailed it, Francesca. Butt, glutes, hip, in that order, intentional breath, move to the roller. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Beautiful. Well, I think we covered a lot today, so I'm gonna wrap up. If any of you have more questions, shoot me a note in the messenger feature, leave a comment in the group, invite anybody you want that you think will get benefit out of this into the group. If you got a lot out of this, I'm sure somebody else would as well, so feel free, send them the link. We'll get them into the group so that they can participate. And again, I'll put all the links in the goodies if you want to download the book, if you guys want to come down to Orlando, see me speak in person, anything like that. That's what I'm here for. I appreciate you all being here, and I will talk to you soon. Have a great rest of your holiday weekend, and I'm looking forward to what 2020 has in store. I'll see you soon.